All right, welcome to the Let It Fly show. I am Michael Severe. I am joined by a special guest this week, Tony Boone, longtime boxing writer and reporter, of course, with the Omaha World Herald, and one of the most knowledgeable boxing fans I know. How you doing, Tony?
Good, and that's a pretty big intro right there.
One time, I gave an overly effusive intro to Dan Raphael, and you texted me. You're like, that's a little much.
Yeah.
That's a little much for Dan.
That's a good point.
And right now, Dan, like anything, you know, there are all the cutbacks with everything.
Sure.
And so he's got like his own Substack or whatever he's doing, you know. I will admit, he breaks more stuff now than when he was with ESPN.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the whole dynamic of that has changed. I often talk about this because people ask me because, you know, on fight nights or fight weeks with Crawford, I would run in those circles and I could tell stories like after fights, like late at night, where all of us would go somewhere to eat, even the time when they were here in town when Crawford fought. And we were having a hard time finding a place that was still open late. We actually went across over by the airport to the Perkins.
Oh,
and
man.
So here's these loudmouths like Raphael and Coppinger and myself. We're all there, and we're all stoked because you're coming off the high of the fight itself.
Sure.
We want to talk about what happened and what else is going on in the sport. And we're just super loud for that crowd, you know, at that time of the night. But we are all like jacked after a fight. And that's the way it is. You know, you're with the adrenaline rush of the night. And it takes a while to come down from that. But it's funny when I tell stories about those guys, just how everything has kind of revolved around then, you know. Coppinger started the thing with Lance Pugmire, who wrote for the LA Times, and you know they went on with The Athletic, and they had a podcast, and they were breaking all the boxing news there. And Raphael was at ESPN, and I was obviously covering stuff for the World Herald. And then the next thing you know, things changed. The Athletic wasn't going to put into that, and Coppinger went to ESPN. And, you know, Dan started doing his own thing, and then Lance went and started selling real estate, and now he's doing the pay-per-view stuff with Jim Lampley and things like that. And like even when Lance like left the LA Times, the guy who is a PR guy from Denver and was a PR guy for Pacquiao for a long time. As soon as Lance left to go to the Athletic, he called me and said, do you want me to call the guy at the LA Times to talk to you? Because he's like, you're the first person I can think of. And it's just funny to watch how all those things have kind of revolved and how guys have moved on as the business has evolved, because obviously, you know, the sports media landscape is ever changing. Yeah.
And the biggest change out of all those is after a fight now, there's someplace to eat. Downtown. We got places to eat actually to stay open, including the Let It Fly Sports Bar here in the Capital District, elevated sports bar experience. It's funny when I look at a place like this, because when I moved here and I left Albuquerque, which was, you know, a lot of college basketball. That was the big thing there. Lobos were huge. And so they had some sports bars, but nothing like this because football wasn't as big. And I searched around town and I ended up at Varsity, 96 and Q. Because I wanted to sit in a place where I could watch all the games, all the NFL games at one time. I did not envision something like this, where I could sit right there and watch everything on one screen. So this is obviously the sports bar I've always been looking for. So it's understandable. Also, we're brought to you by Bud Light. Whether you're hanging out here at the Let It Fly Sports Bar, you're at home, you're in your man cave, wherever you are, easy drinking, easy to enjoy. College night, by the way, brand new thing here. Wednesday nights, 8 o'clock to close, live DJ and drink specials. Downtown location only, $15 cover if you're under 21. Free if you're over 21. Ooh, and kitchen is open till 10 p.m. So Wednesday night, college night, if you want to go out and have some fun.
You'll probably still be here because for us, although we keep aging and our beards get a little grayer,
they're very gray,
every time that we see each other, we are always mindset college age. We never really move on from that.
That is, well, for many different things, I'm that way. Like I'm thinking about right now, I know the weather's getting bad, but I really like the Clippers tonight at minus 2.5, 2.5. So I'm gonna have to go over river. Also a big deal here with this deal with Red Bull. So we have a $4 Red Bull watermelon margarita every day. And tomorrow, when this drops on Wednesday, of course, we have Dollar Wings Wednesday as well with all the great the flavors you always expect. We're going to get into the state of boxing and then also, of course, talk about Crawford and Canelo, a fight that I think most people on average said it would never happen. Like, right? And then it kind of was like, oh, it's happening. And then I wake up one morning like, no, it's canceled. And like, it's back. I'm like, that's boxing. But we're going to talk about that. Before that, though, just a couple of headlines for this week. 4 members of the Nebraska football team went to the combine. Only 3 worked out. And it's funny because, and I know you grew up pretty much around here. The idea of Husker Power was always this big thing. And as a guy who's always been a draft nerd, I was always impressed that they would have these great short shuttles and 40 times. It's back because Ty Robinson was the fastest interior defensive lineman. Thomas Fidone was the third most athletic tight end, which is funny to think about because not many people think about that. I'm assuming you watched Thomas in high school, right?
Sure.
Over at Lewis Central. Yeah. And then Isaiah Nair, who everybody was down on, he was essentially the most athletic for his size wide receiver at 6'4", 218. He jumped 11 feet 1 inch in the broad, and then he went 38 inches in the vert, and he ran a 4.4 at that size. So obviously Husker Power's back.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about Fidone, I'm always interested in guys who grew up here locally.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the guys that played in Nebraska also have an interest here locally, too, because people kind of adopt them as their own. But the guys who grew up around here, who you watch develop through the high school ranks or whatever, and even going on farther, and even take it a step further than this, for myself in particular, for this draft, I'm looking to see what happens with Hunter Deckers. I don't know that he'll get drafted, but what a strange story that is. Here's a kid that grew up in Nowheresville, north of Sioux City in Iowa, not far from here. He lit up some local teams in the playoffs coming up. I remember seeing him play a high school playoff game in Iowa way back when, and I was just filling in for Kevin White for that night, and I came back, and I'm like, I don't know that I've ever seen a better high school quarterback at that age. And he was a sophomore or junior at West Sioux at that time, but he just crushed Trainer that night. And I'm like, this kid can make every throw, and he's already doing it, and I understand the level he's playing at. But the next thing you knew, he's at Iowa State and starting already as an underclassman back right after the Purdy era ended there. And, obviously his story is well told now, gotten caught in the gambling sting over there, couldn't play by the NCAAs anymore. And ended up playing over here at Iowa Western, and I saw him every game this past year, and now he's going in the draft, and Gruden just dropped a quarterback thing with him this week. And
really?
Like,
I got to look that up. I didn't see that.
And I'm like, what's going to happen with a kid like this who was playing Power 5 football as an underclassman as a starting quarterback and had nowhere to go and seemingly had no future not long ago, and suddenly there he is.
That's a mini 30 for 30.
Sure.
There's enough in there.
Especially if it turns out to be great.
If he works out for him. I'm interested in Marquis Siegel, a kid who went to Omaha North, who wanted to come to Nebraska. He wasn't quite the size and what they thought for a safety to come to Nebraska. He goes and plays, small college football. Then all of a sudden, he's at Kansas State, like out of nowhere. And I'm watching him make tackles on Saturday. And he goes to the combine. He runs a 4.38, something like that, the combine at the safeties position. The kid's going to get drafted now. And he was one of those people who was a little undeveloped. Wasn't good enough to play in Nebraska.
It's amazing to see how the world has changed with regards to recruiting, where kids end up and what kids end up being once they're through developing as college players. And now the transfer portal has changed everything. You're here one year and you're somewhere else the next. But I think all the way back to when recruiting's really taking off and there first started being national recruiting reports, and I was just a youngster out of college working in radio here in downtown Omaha, just a couple of blocks from here. And there was a national recruiting guy named Bobby Burton.
Yeah, sure.
And I remember and I remember him calling me on the phone because we did stuff with him every week on local sports talk shows, the early sports talk shows here before we had all sports radio stations, and him calling and saying, Tony, I just got that Bobby Newcomb tape.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I've been broadcasting games here in Omaha for the last couple of years. Eric Crouch is pretty good.
Yeah, sure.
And they were coming in at the same time. And just the discussions then about the future of Nebraska quarterbacking and thinking of opportunities the kids had. And that was the recruiting services back then. And now your video's everywhere. Everyone sees you. And if you aren't offered by Nebraska or even more regionally, Iowa or Iowa State, and you're a kid that grew up on one side of the river or another, there's another school.
They'll find you.
Yeah, there's another school that's going to find you.
They'll find you.
And you're going to get your opportunity. And now with the transfer portal, you may not even be at that place very long. So
hell, you may end up back here.
Exactly. It's changed the entire landscape.
It has.
And we've seen those things happen with college basketball players too. Football's a big one because you're talking a lot more numbers. But even college basketball guys, look what guys are doing, other places. Hunter Salas is at Wake Forest.
Yeah.
And John Tonji, he's averaging, 19 a game?
Probably going to be Big Ten Player of the Year.
Yeah, in Wisconsin. There are opportunities everywhere, and nowadays they will find you. It didn't always used to be like that.
And I watched Tanji play in high school up the road right here at Central, and I thought he was good, but I didn't think he was a power four or however you call it for basketball. But then I watch him play now, and I'm like, damn, you're going to develop. It also helps when you're 23, and the other guys you're playing against are 18.
Yeah.
It helps you a little bit. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but we saw it with BYU for years in football, where they would have guys who were 26 and 25 years old playing against 18, 19-year-old kids, and they look better.
Back to the football thing, the same thing you were saying, when I was covering Iowa Western football in its early days of the program, their second year they went to a bowl game and played against Snow College out there in Utah. Same thing. And they were 23 and 24-year-old sophomores.
Victory Haynes.
Playing against 18 to 19-year-old freshman and sophomore from Omaha and Council Bluffs area. Over at Iowa Western. So
and now Victory Haynes, who played at that Snow College, who came to Nebraska, who got knocked out by Indomitian Sioux at one point, is now a coach locally. Wow. He's a local coach. Comes full circle. But speaking of Iowa Western, the Jet Award winner this year, Caden Weegent, former Iowa Western guy, played in national championship games.
Seen a lot of good guys come through that program.
Oh yeah. I was very happy that he won the award. I don't vote on the award. I have a panel that votes on the award. But I'm sitting at my uncle's house right on the state line of Mississippi, Louisiana, a place called Pearl River, and we're watching the bowl game. And I said to my uncle, I go, all I want is for Caden Weegent to return a punt or a kickoff for a touchdown, because that'll be enough, I think, for everybody to vote for him. He already was leading the country in combined. He's like second or third in kickoff and punt return yardage. I'm like, he gets one more, he's going to win it. First punt to him, he got down the side. I'm like, go, please go. Yeah. And I'm like, no flags. And he won it. So I'm happy. That's April 10th. And Caden will be here with some members of the Iowa crew. Of course, they're doing spring practice. Mm-hmm. So now all the coaches can come. But I think LeVar Woods is going to come, the special teams coach. So that'll be kind of cool.
Still super cool little local kid.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Or at least a kid we could watch locally.
Exactly. Exactly. I'm very excited about that. We're taping on a Tuesday. So obviously, when this comes out tomorrow, it'll be after Ohio State and Nebraska, which is kind of like the last stand for Nebraska after losing to Minnesota over the weekend. They've got to beat Ohio State. Ohio State has to win to keep their dream of getting in the tournament alive. I'm not sure I remember a Husker basketball season that's had that many ups and downs. Like, you felt really good, and you're like, oh, it's over. 6 losses in a row. Oh, then it came back and won 4 out of 6. And it's like, it's the weirdest thing. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah, it's been an interesting basketball season within my family. Mm-hmm. Because I'm a Nebraska grad, and my son is just fascinated by the fact that my 4 years in Nebraska happened to be the 4-year tournament run in the early 90s. So that was the big day of Nebraska basketball. He went to Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was really good when he was there.
Right.
The Trae Young was in his class, Peyton's class. They were both freshmen at the same time. Nice. So we followed Oklahoma basketball, and we both, outside of that, are North Carolina fans. Oh. And everything you hear this week is like, okay, which of these 3 are you taking? Because one's getting in, maybe, and 2 are out.
Right.
And it's those 3 teams, and it's where do your loyalties lie?
Yeah, it's crazy.
As longtime North Carolina fans and grads of both of those other schools that are in the talk.
Which one do you think is? Who do you think it is?
I don't know. I have no idea. It probably depends on the day, just like you said.
Yeah, it does. It really does. And it's going to come down to, we forget, once this regular season ends, you're going to have an opportunity in your conference tournament. You win 2 or 3 games. I don't know if that means as much as it used to, but still, if it puts a number up where it says you've won 20 games or you've won 21, obviously that's going to make a difference. So, and then the Jays are playing tonight too. They're playing at Seton Hall. Seton Hall is tragically bad. They're 2-16 in the Big East. But anytime you go on the road in a power conference, you never know. They went to Xavier over the weekend. Creighton did. Ended up losing by 22. So you never know what could happen. But I'm assuming when this comes out Wednesday, Creighton will have won, beat up on Seton Hall. For Nebraska and Ohio State, I have no idea.
Yeah, I'd have to be right there with you. And what a fantastic run this has been for Creighton recently.
It's incredible.
Yeah, and just to watch how those seasons have played out when the seasons start the way they do, and you go through your things throughout the season, and just to watch how they've come up at the end. And obviously, with all these teams, it's how they're playing come tournament time.
And Missouri Valley, we watched them play in the Mo Valley for all those years. I got here in 2002, and they didn't move to the biggest to 2012, something in there. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a whole different world. And I remember interviewing Coach Mack and saying, "What do you need? Like, 2014 actually? What do you need?" And he goes, "We got to get longer on the wings. We've got to get more physical guards who can get in the paint and make plays, and we got to have more size." And if you look at this team, when they're healthy, obviously, Pop getting hurt was a difference for them because he could really drive to the basket. But they have that. They have more length. They got some size. Now, obviously, Ashworth's not a big guy, but he's tough, and he plays like a big guy. And then going to being 1 second away from a Final Four, getting to an Elite Eight, getting to multiple Sweet 16s. You can't – Coach Mack, if we're talking about coaches in the history of the state of Nebraska, he's like 3. It's like number 3. Because it's Osborne, Devaney, and then it's Coach Mack with the progress he's made. If he wins a championship, obviously, be everything. I mentioned we're going to talk about boxing. Obviously, I said, Tony, how long did you cover?
Boxing?
Yeah.
Oh boy, I think my first boxing event I covered for the World Heralds was 2004.
Okay.
So covering boxing, I guess you could take it from that point. But really, I started before that. I wasn't here because I moved outstate. I was in Hastings then. But even when I was writing for the paper in Hastings, Nebraska, I covered boxing events for both that paper and other papers then. There just wasn't as much going on here. And we can get into a little bit of that as we're going on, because when Crawford came around and first started making his run, it was historically down in Nebraska. Like, we're talking years and years without even having a professional card in the state. And I always tell this story back, which happened back in 2010. There was a fight out in Grand Island. And it was a Showtime fight they just needed a venue. That small arena in Grand Island happened to be open, and Showtime came in for a Friday night showbox event. And Terrence ended up fighting on the undercard of that night. But I always tell people of this night, because I think it kind of puts into perspective where we were at before this Crawford thing came along and took off. So Showtime rolls in, and we're there at a car place, and I forget what the name of the company was, but they had the weigh-ins and things like that at an auto place. Like, they were the big sponsor, so they had the weigh-ins and stuff there. And I remember the Showtime crew showing up or whatever, and I end up running into Steve Farhood, who you've seen on Showtime broadcast as their official scorer and things like that for years. He was previously the editor of Ring Magazine. He's in the Boxing Hall of Fame, so he's an in-the-know guy in the sport. And we introduce ourselves to each other at that event. And one of the greatest moments of my life as a writer, and second, kind of explaining how this what was at the time for boxing in Nebraska. He came up to me and he asked me, he's like, so give me the significance of what's going on here and what's kind of like boxing like here. And I'm like, well, we haven't had a professional event in the state for 5 or 6 years now. Haven't had a historical night in boxing in the state since, Ron Standard fought Joe Frazier for the heavyweight title in 1972. Right. And if you want to go back to when a Nebraska fighter last fought for something that big, we're going back to the late 20s when, Ace Hudkins, fought Mickey Walker for the middleweight championship. And I go, that's it for our sport. Yeah. And in a great moment in my life, Steve Farhood looks at me and goes, every time you go somewhere new, there's that guy you need to meet. And you're that guy.
You're that guy. Yeah. There's no doubt about that.
You're that guy. But that tells you where we're at then. And to think that on that card was Terrence Crawford. And I remember Farhood asking me, he's like, is there anything that we need to pay attention to on these undercards? And I explained Crawford, his amateur background, how we haven't had a fighter like this come from Omaha. But if we're ever going to have one, this is the guy. Right. And I swear to God that I thought that I got Crawford signed by a big company that night. Yeah. Because the next night when he knocked out the guy that he fought on the undercard, which wasn't televised, Steve Farhood walks by and taps on the table in front of me. He's like, your guy's pretty good. Yeah. Meaning our guy from here in Nebraska and everything like that. And I go, oh my God, Crawford's going to get like a top rank or, big kind of deal out of this that night. Right. Just because I said something to the right guy. Yeah. It didn't end up happening.
Took a little bit longer. Yeah.
But Crawford ended up getting with top rank. And here we are 10 years later talking about him being an all-time great. Before
we talk about what could be the fight of the century, give me your grade on the state of boxing currently, because it's in a weird time. You've got the influencers and you've got some guys who are older and gone now. And then you always have the controversy. It's with boxing. Anytime you have a sport that has scoring, you can have some controversy. But if you're going to give a grade, A, B, C, D, whatever, for the state of boxing currently, what would it be?
I'd probably have to say B, because I think there's always room to grow. So I don't want to give out those A grades when I think there can be better.
Does it require an American heavyweight champion to have an A?
No, I think what it requires, outside of nationals or champions, what it really requires is something that every other sport has, is like a governing body.
Sure, right.
And
one governing body.
Yes, exactly. And that's been the problem with boxing, is it's, there are four main, labels or four main organizations that oversee the sport, but each just handles its own. And all these boxers are trying to compete for belts on each of these four things, which are all to the general public kind of seen equally, not really one more than the other. They all have their own rules. They all have their own rankings. And it's just hard for, the common person who isn't in depth following the sport, to keep track of everything. The thing that has changed in the last few years that has made it better is the now influence of one person who happens to have billions of dollars and loves boxing.
The Saudi guy.
Yes, Turki Al-Sheikh.
Yeah.
He has put money where mouths used to be. He's taken promoters who will fight each other and not work with each other to give people the big fights and just kind of pushed them all out of the way. Mm-hmm. And he's dealing with teams individually. Promoters are kind of following in a long time. We are starting to see the fights that we want to see.
Where are they, though?
Well, okay. So most of them so far have been overseas.
Yeah, but I mean, where they are on TV, where you watch them? Pay-per-view only?
Oh, yes. Okay.
It's just on the Zone?
And that's the other thing. It's in different places. We used to...
Yep. And then ABC would have a...
Exactly. Watch, say, Tuesday night fights.
ESPN had some fights, yeah.
So we had a lot of places we could get into where your big two were.
Yeah.
Now everything's almost exclusively streamed somewhere.
Right.
You're not seeing it on TV unless it's a top-ranked card on ESPN. Mm-hmm. But yes, a lot of them are going to DAZN, or you can pay-per-view them on Prime or ESPN Plus, and sometimes it's a combination of the two.
And Netflix is probably getting into that too.
Netflix is too, and obviously they tried and didn't do so well with the Mike Tyson-Jake Paul fight last year. But, that's kind of the way it is. So you have to be invested in that fight and then find out how to go find that fight.
Yeah.
That is a problem, and that's certainly something that needs to rise to the A level, where there's a more constant thing that this becomes the go-to place to go to fights. And that's what DAZN wanted to be. Mm-hmm. But I don't know financially that they probably did it in the way that they needed to do. And now they have it so having to pay for an app per month and then pay for fights on top of that.
Right. Yeah.
Wasn't what to do, but they kind of priced themselves out when they got that big contract with Canelo, and then they had to start pay-per-viewing them, and that's kind of hurt their cause or whatever. So I think the watching it has become problematic in that sense, but as far as the organizations and getting the big fights, I feel sorry for Terrence, honestly, because had Turki come in with his money, in the Saudi money, earlier in his career, he would have had a lot bigger fights before now. Because a lot of that stuff that happened to him when he was 147 pounds, the first-time crew with Premier Boxing Champions, when he got set on the outside and all those guys fought each other, and he was there ready and clamoring for a big fight, if this was happening then. I feel sorry for him about that, but I do think that that's why he's able to get fights here at the end of his career.
I want to get Tony's here on Let It Fly Show talking about the state of boxing. So one of the big concerns, different than him, if you have a 0 next to your name, it's so important in boxing for a lot of people, where it was. Do you think that's changing now because we can pay you enough to put that 0 on the line?
Sure. And we're seeing that happen. And I think that a great example of that is the fight that just happened recently, which is a rematch of a fight that happened late last year. One is an absolute train, destroys everybody, hadn't not knocked out anybody until they fought each other. Bivol is this overly skilled boxer first, puncher second. And they were on a collision course. Both had titles. Both were undefeated. Obvious to everybody, they needed to fight each other. Right. These are the kind of fights that weren't happening before.
That's right, yeah.
Because people were protecting O's and promoters were trying to, keep them away from each other. One guy with money got him in the ring last year. Super close fight. I thought that a decision went away that maybe it shouldn't have. It was close enough that they had a rematch, which did go the other way just a couple of weeks ago. And nobody now cares that Beterbiev and Bivol each have a 1 in their loss column because they came against each other. And we saw 2 great fights and probably will get a third.
Yeah, you can still be – that's the thing about UFC, whatever, is that you could still be the best at your weight class and have 4 or 5 losses because they want you to fight. It never seemed like it was that way in boxing. The other thing that occasionally will come up is like what happened in the Tank Davis fight, right? The knockdown, he kneeled down or whatever. Obviously, anybody who's watched boxing, you know that's a knockdown. It doesn't get counted, ends up being a draw. Is there – you think if we had a commission that was over everything, they could step up and say, that was wrong, we're going to reverse it?
I don't know if they would reverse it after the fact. I think if that was the case, it might have it would have happened that night.
Instant replay.
And probably after that round.
Yeah.
And I think that in New York, which is where the fight was, if I remember right.
Yep. They said there was technical difficulties.
Yes.
They claimed.
Yes. Yeah. That I think that they even have instant replay there. Clearly that's something that should have been corrected in the moment. And one of the things that hurts boxing in particular, and this would go to other combat events, is that the officials and the judges and stuff like that are often held within the rules of that athletic commission. And what happens in New York may not be in Nebraska, may not be in California, may not be there. And so, while those high-level officials and judges usually are the same names and faces you hear a lot of times, they aren't. And I was really surprised that it was Steve Willis who was in the ring that did that.
Because he's
done a ton of big fights.
Right, I know.
And so for him to not call that a knockdown when Tank Davis, if you haven't seen it, and I wasn't watching the fight live, but I saw the replay.
Yeah, me too.
He took the knee on purpose.
Right.
You know, it wasn't from a punch or anything like that. He took the knee on purpose. It's basically a break. But if you do that, it's an automatic knockdown.
Right.
You get the count, and then the referee decides if you want to continue or not. And Tank even went a step further. Not only to take the knee, he walked back to his corner.
And got his face wiped off.
Yeah, it was almost like he was trying to take a timeout.
He's like, it's my own personal standing 8 count or something like that.
Yeah, it was unreal, and it did eventually, change the outcome of the fight because it wasn't called a knockdown, and they did end it in a draw.
Yeah. So I want to go back to heavyweight because, throughout different parts of our lives, I remember watching in 78, watching Norton fight Holmes for that vacant title, and we were all going nuts because I actually was living in Easton, Pennsylvania at the time. But having that heavyweight that everybody knows, and Usyk is really good, obviously.
Yeah.
I've made lots of money betting on him. But he's not an American. He's not somebody that we know. What do you think about his popularity? What do you think about that division right now, the heavyweight division?
It's different, and I think that it's gone the way where it went from like guys who were skilled and bigger to guys who were bigger and maybe not as skilled.
Yeah.
And now it's getting back with Usyk to now we're getting guys who are skilled again who are bigger.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting for him is that he's done basically what Evander Holyfield did. He became a champion at the weight class under and moved up and said, I'm willing to take on these bigger guys, knowing that naturally I'm giving up some, physical presence in here. I'm not going to be bigger. I'm not going to be stronger, but I'm going to be more skilled than those guys. And he's made it work against guys, that are 6'5" and Anthony Joshua to 6'9" and Tyson Fury.
Yeah.
And for, him to decisively beat those guys, more than once, and become the heavyweight champion, it's super interesting. But like you said, it's not something that, the everyday sports fan in America is going to gravitate to.
Right.
I mean, Usyk's going to go down as an all-time great fighter.
Right.
I don't know if he'll ever be considered an all-time great heavyweight just because.
But pound for pound wise.
But yes. But no one's going to question his pedigree, like when he's getting ready to go into the Hall of Fame or anything like that, the way they might have some other heavyweights by saying, oh, it was a bad era or anything like that. No, he did the legwork before that.
Yeah.
All this heavyweight stuff is kind of gravy added on top to the already stacked, Usyk resume. But you're right as far as the interest here, and we really haven't had, since the Tyson Bowe Holyfield era. But I'm talking about American guys. Yeah, the popularity of those guys, we haven't had that since. Even though Deontay Wilder was a heavyweight champion for a while, and we've had other guys who have gone up to grab a belt.
If Fury doesn't get up, if he stays down, maybe Wilder becomes this force in America as a heavyweight.
Sure. Well, at least in American popularity.
Yeah, definitely. Because he was a fun guy, and he's big, heavy-handed dude.
Sure, and people love knockouts. That's what they come to see, especially with the heavyweight fights. I don't know we're going to get that back. And this is the same thing we've talked about all the time when we talk about the era that you were talking about. Bigger kids are getting identified earlier.
Other sports.
And they're in other sports.
Yeah.
Our potential heavyweight champions are playing, left tackle.
Yeah.
The post guy in basketball or playing a different sport. They're not whereas overseas that's not the case.
Yeah. One more Usyk thing. So he fought the Dubois guy, and that was a good fight. I think it ended like in the 9th. But would you like to see a rematch of that? Because that seemed like out of all his fights, I thought that was a pretty good one out of the ones I watched.
Well, I think because that guy has now come up to be probably maybe the second best heavyweight in the moment, I think people would want to see it again because it's one of those things where it happened at a time before you realized how big that probably was. You're like, oh, now that win looks really good because Usyk's beating these other guys, and he looks like he's the next best heavyweight out there.
Yeah.
And now people, I think, would want to see that fight. Yeah. It was just weird that it timed out that happened before, he went Fury, or Joshua, Fury, and got all those wins and really established himself now as the heavyweight. And it's funny to me how when Crawford unified the belts at 140, what an anomaly that was.
It's so hard to do.
Yeah, and now how often we've seen it since. Yeah. It's like people have really gone out of their ways to make these fights happen.
Right.
And to think that now Usyk and he have each done it twice in 2 different weight classes is really incredible.
Tony Boone joining us on Let It Fly show. Before we get to Crawford and Alvarez, your thoughts on the influences and Jake Paul and those fights, which obviously have drawn some big numbers. I'll tell you one thing. I'm not a sentimental guy if it involves kids. I am. That Tyson thing, the bit I could see between the wearing and everything, that just made me feel bad. You know, it made me feel sad watching this 58 or whatever year old man out there fighting some kid. It was disgusting to me.
The only thing I can say as a positive thing that comes out of things like that is if it gets somebody else introduced to the sport that maybe wouldn't have watched it otherwise.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And like, hey, you know what? That was a big event. It was kind of cool. I like the atmosphere. Maybe I'll give boxing a shot again. Mm-hmm. I like it for that sense, but that's the only thing I like about it. I think I remember when you and Josh and I were talking, this would have been last time I was on, right before the Spence fight. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about influencers getting involved. And for those of us who have always liked this sport, it's going to constantly be a distraction.
Sure.
And I understand there's money involved and things like that. And you had mentioned that, earlier that Crawford Alvarez looked like it was on, and then it looked like it was off, and then it was on. The reason it was off for a half second, it seemed like because they were talking about Alvarez maybe fighting Jake Paul in the middle there. And while I get there's a bunch of money to be had by that, nobody wants to see it. But there's a part of me as a boxing guy that's like, let's see it. And turn Canelo Alvarez loose on that and in, this sideshow that we all have to deal with.
That's what it needs. That's what you needed to happen.
Yes.
You need somebody just to knock him out and put
Jake Paul has not fought an elite level fighter like a boxer yet.
Yeah.
And until he does, this is going to continue. And I think that he'll bring out others who are going to try to do the same.
Yeah.
As soon as he fights somebody that's like a top 10 guy, he's going to get exposed right away. And this will all probably end because people will understand that he's not the next heavyweight champion in the making.
Right, no doubt, or light heavyweight or anything else. Is it okay if I can read a quote from your text that you sent me?
Sure.
We were talking about Bud Crawford fighting Canelo Alvarez and what would happen in it, right? And we were going back to what happened. You said, because I asked you about 168, and you said, the weight isn't a factor to me for that one. Same height, and Bud has a reach advantage, and Canelo doesn't move. You still feel the same way about September?
I do. And after we chatted this morning, I kind of went back and was doing some deep diving and rewatching some things. You know, obviously I would have done that ahead of time if we'd have talked about this appearance beforehand.
Yeah.
But I'm like, okay, I saw that text too, and I do still feel the same way. I'm surprised that more people don't feel that way.
There are people, though. I've watched people that believe it, but they're rare.
Yes, but most don't, and I think because Canelo is such an attraction, they want to show everyone saying how Crawford doesn't have a chance, so we see that a lot more through social media and things like that.
And people don't believe, and I hate this, you hate this, they don't believe Crawford's fought anybody.
Yes, that's totally wrong.
I know. He fought everybody he's supposed to fight for the most part, and he's dominated them. That's what you're supposed to
do. There are two things about Crawford's career that are we're always going to look back on and say, dang, I wish it could have been different.
Sure.
The first is Top Rank had both he and Manny Pacquiao in their stable at the same time.
Right.
That was the fight that needed to happen, but here was the problem with it, and I will forever be talking about this until I go to the grave. I think Bob Arum never wanted to feed his cash cow to his young lion until it was the absolute last possible time.
Right.
So they kept dangling a potential Pacquiao fight in front of Crawford as an incentive to go out and perform and stay with them.
Right.
The problem was Pacquiao was never on board with that, and what ended up happening is he ended up ditching Top Rank before they actually ever made that fight.
Right.
So he got away before they could do the turnover, and I think it was just a matter of Top Rank seeing Pacquiao bring the money in, and they wanted to keep getting it for as long as they could before they gave him to Crawford, and then he would have become the star attraction at that point.
Right.
Pacquiao got away. That fight never happened, and that probably cheated Bud of getting the recognition he deserved. Because if he would have destroyed Pacquiao.
Yeah,
absolutely destroyed him. And if he'd have gotten that, then I think people would have understood from that part that he was going to be at this level no matter who he fought.
Yeah.
So all those fights that everyone says, well, he hasn't fought anybody, it wouldn't have mattered because everyone would have understood how good Crawford is already.
Yeah.
That they wouldn't have cared that he was fighting an unbeaten guy that they hadn't heard of or whatever. And then when Bud made that guy look average, then it wouldn't have mattered as much as it did.
Yeah.
It held him back for a long time. It took until the Spence fight for people went, oh. Okay.
And then people still make all these excuses for Spence. They're saying now that maybe he had like a torn ligament in his leg or something else was hurt. Listen, I went back and I counted up. It was 11 fights. He lost like 6 rounds in 11 fights.
I actually saw that tweet from you this morning.
I mean, I went back. I'm like, do you think about that? it's one thing, and this is like I'll go back to football for a second, but Indiana, right? The Hoosiers, they ain't playing nobody, but they beat everybody by 40.
Sure.
So you got to do what you got to do, and that's what Crawford did. He took care of business, and then I remember back because people said the same thing about Mayweather. They would say the same thing about guys because they made the guy you thought was good when you were talking about it all week look bad.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden he wasn't as good. Which is it's not just boxing, it happens in other sports too, but that always drives me crazy.
Yeah, and the second thing with Crawford was just the having to wait so long for the Spence fight.
Yeah.
There were guys there when he moved up to 147, and I understand the move by Crawford. He had already done everything at 140. He's always been a guy, what's the next thing I can do?
Yeah.
He was always looking for milestones and legacy-defining moments. Mm-hmm. And once you've gotten everything in a weight class, the idea of becoming the Bernard Hopkins that weight class and just staying there for years and years and years and dominating as the champion of 140 pounds probably wasn't enticing to him because he's always been after the next thing.
Right.
And so the move up and the potential big fights makes sense. I was saying in the moment that until you got that Spence fight, that maybe you don't do that. And I have no idea whether Terrence was struggling to make 140 at the end or not.
Yeah.
So maybe he needed to move up just for his own, personal reasons as well. But there just wasn't in his mindset anything for him to do down there. But that time spent at 147 just running through guys didn't help at all because until he fought one of those other guys that were all on the other station and working with the other promoters, he wasn't going to get the credit that he was due.
Do you have any concern that Alvarez is going to fight probably in May and Crawford's not? Any concern about that? He'll be, keep him busy a little bit?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a little bit today. Like, where do I see the advantages and disadvantages? Assuming that this thing in September is going to go off and assuming that Canelo Alvarez holds serve, beats William Skull on May 3rd, I think it is. Yeah. And so what's happened is, and the reason that fight's happening is Canelo had all the belts at 168. Because as we were talking about earlier, there's 4 different sanctioning bodies. You have mandatory obligations to fight other guys. Right. One of Canelo's belts got taken away because he hadn't fought their mandatory guy. Skull now has that belt. So this fight in May is to get Canelo back to undisputed status for a potential fight with Crawford.
Right.
First and foremost. So I don't think it matters as far as the activity goes. What's been happening about the last 5 years, Canelo has been fighting about twice a year, and Crawford's been fighting once. Right. And so far, we haven't seen like ring rust and things like that from Terrence for not fighting as much. All of us, just as people that enjoy watching him fight, wish that there was more than one a year.
Yeah.
I don't know that I really worry about that, but the activity certainly is something that's in Canelo's favor. And everything that I texted you, I think still stands. The advantages that Canelo has are he's been at 168 a lot longer.
Sure.
So he's in that division. Like he's a 168 pounder and he's a killer in that division. Obviously he lost to Bivol when he tried to move up and fight a bigger guy. But he has been dominant at 168. He is not the bigger guy. He will be the stronger guy. Crawford is a half-inch taller, and he has a longer reach. Those are going to play into Crawford's things. Canelo is going to be more aggressive than Crawford is. Crawford is a much better counterpuncher. He's a much better mover. He's got a lot more tools in the shed than what Canelo does. All those would be in Crawford's favor. I think stamina, assuming that goes with Crawford going up, will be better. Canelo maybe kind of gasses out at the end of fights, but he's going to be in there to beat you down. The fight that I am thinking of when I think of this fight is 10 years old, and it shouldn't matter, but it's when Canelo fought Arislandi Lara.
Lara,
154 pounds. Yeah. Lara is a left-handed guy, which is how Crawford chooses to fight.
Yep.
Extremely disciplined. Very defensive fighter, always is on the move. People hate watching him fight because they think he's boring, but he knows that's how he wins. And I think he's probably one of the most underrated fighters of this era because people just don't want to watch him fight. But man, is that guy tough to beat. And the only losses in his career have come by majority decision or split decision, so nobody really gets the best of that guy. And when he fought Canelo chased him all around the ring. Lara never let him set up, never let him cut him off, and that thing went to the scorecards, and it was a question, and it ended up being a split decision victory. One judge had Lara winning, 2 had Canelo winning. 2 of them were 115, 113, so 7 rounds to 5 both ways. And I'm like, if Crawford fights this fight, that's going to be tough for Canelo, even at 168.
But it seems to me, at least in his last couple of fights, Bud's wanted to stand in there
Sure.
more. Was it, oh, God, Medvedev, what's his, Israel?
Medvedev.
He, out of all the fights I've ever watched, I thought that was Bud's hardest fight.
Yes.
Because he decided he wanted to throw, and that kid's like, what was that, 23? He's young kid, right? Are you worried at all about him deciding I'm going to stand in here and fight with this stronger guy?
No, and I don't know that it was even as much of that. The thing with Madrimov is that guy was so herky-jerky and moving all the time. Mm-hmm. I don't know that Terrence ever felt like he had a spot in the fight where like, okay, now I've gotten into my rhythm, which we see in almost every one of his fights.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
he's a hard guy to figure out because there was no rhythm to his game. He was moving one way 1 second, one way another second. He didn't have a pattern that you could follow. And I just think that Crawford had a hard time finding a spot where, okay, this is where the guy's going to be stationary and I can land something big. I didn't feel like that fight was in question. It was funny when I heard the scores at the end of the fight.
But that's how I had it scored.
What, 115, 113?
Yeah.
I went back and...
it was the closest I'd ever scored a fight.
Yeah, I went back and re-looked at the judges' scorecard this morning from that. Mm-hmm. And I know you and I have talked about this after fights before. But what were the judges seeing in the moment? Now, 2 of them had 115, 113, and one had it more 116, 112, which is 8 rounds to 4 for Crawford, which is about how I saw it. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the judges' scorecards and see how did each judge score each round, they didn't get to the 115, 113s in the exact same way.
Right, yeah.
The rounds that all 3 judges saw Crawford winning were the first 2 and the last 2. So there were 4 of them.
Right.
The rounds that all 3 judges saw Madrimov winning were 2 of them. Mm-hmm. So that's 6 of the rounds. The other ones were the ones that were split.
Right.
But of those other ones, there were only 2 of the other 6 that 2 of the 3 judges saw Madrimov winning. So if you look at who more judges saw win each round, you get to 8-4, which is the fight I thought I saw.
Right.
And, when you're saying it's 115, 113, that's only 1 round more.
Yeah.
So that's not out of the question. I don't think the scorecards were ridiculous in, that way. But it clearly was tougher for him. There wasn't a lot of punch disparity as far as what was landing from. I mean, I think I saw something that there were only 2 rounds in the entire fight where one guy landed more than 2 shots than the other guy. Yeah. It was a really low output fight.
Punch differential was very low.
Yes, and a really low output fight for both fighters. But I didn't think it was anything that Crawford did. And it was funny just rewatching that fight and listening to the announcers, which I don't normally care about or do.
It's hard.
But it was funny because they had 2 guys who were former fighters that were on there. Mm-hmm. And one of them was Sergio Mora, who kind of won fights like Madrimov wins fights. It's going to be kind of a messy, let me slop it up and let's make it a super close fight because I'm not going to be orthodox or whatever. The other was Sean Porter, who's fought Crawford and fought at a super high level.
Right.
And we're halfway through the fight and like Sean Porter's, I have it 5-1 to Crawford.
Yeah.
And whereas Mora's like, I think I have, even or maybe Madrimov slightly ahead.
Yep.
And but obviously their biases kind of come into that. That's how Mora had to fight to be competitive in big fights.
Right.
And Sean sees what he sees in high skill level and obviously knows Crawford.
Yeah.
Those fights are tough to judge. I do agree with you that it was his toughest fight because there was never a point where you felt like, okay, now he's got this.
The rhythm line is perfect. He used. He does find a rhythm.
Yeah. And he takes over fights. Mm-hmm. And they usually go in a landslide after that. That one never happened like that.
Yeah. Before we let you go, before we end this, give me a prediction. What do you think is method of round? What do you think happens?
Well, I obviously I think
I know it's a long ways away.
Yeah. If it even happens at all.
Yes, sir.
Like, a lot of things can happen.
Of course, right.
I don't think it's a fight that doesn't go the distance. And there are multiple reasons for that. For as big and strong and as many power punches as Canelo throws, he's not a knockout puncher.
Right.
He breaks guys down over time, kind of like Crawford does, in a different way. But he's not, other than a couple of guys who have historically bad chins, Kirkland and Khan, who he knocked out spectacularly with one punch.
Hey, Khan was in that fight.
But yeah, he was winning that fight.
He was winning that fight, yeah.
Yeah, halfway through.
Yep.
And again, that was at a lower weight class.
Sure, right.
And, Amir Khan obviously
was boxing him.
Yes, was outboxing him. Yeah. And that's why I think Crawford has a chance. And I used Lara as the example just because of the left-handed thing.
Right.
Who is the best left-handed fighter that Canelo's fought? And Erislandy Lara is clearly it.
Right.
And he gave him problems because it was because he never stayed still. And I see that being the fight that Crawford fights. I don't imagine Crawford's now. Will at some points will he stand in there and trade with Canelo? Sure, because he's a dog, and it'll get the best of him.
He's
from
stubborn.
Time to, yes, it'll be the best of him from time to time.
Right.
I don't think he'll do that more. Go way back to the early Crawford days where he was boxer first before he became this annihilator at 140 and 147. Mm-hmm. He was a better fighter than the other guys because he outboxed them.
Yeah.
Think back to like his first big 10-round fight when he fought Bradis Prescott.
Yep.
When he went left-handed exclusively, really for the first time.
Dominated.
And dominated that fight. I see him fighting that way. Yep. And I see it being a close fight, much like the last fight where you're going to have rounds that you give either way. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a 50-50. I think that Crawford, unlike what some people are telling you, has a real shot in this thing. Right. And I think the fact that Canelo is not a big mover, he loves to stand flat-footed and trade power shots, fits right into Crawford's thing. Another thing about Madrimov, too, he kind of made Crawford go first a lot. Mm-hmm. Terrence is he's a better counterpuncher, and that's what he wants to do. Yeah. Canelo is going to be your face. He is there to be hit. Mm-hmm. And Crawford will be able to score offensively against him. It's just a matter of, I don't think he can hurt Canelo because Canelo's got a chin from God.
Yeah.
And I don't know that Canelo can get Crawford cornered to really do like any kind of damage to end a fight. Like Crawford will move enough to never be in that situation.
So it could come down to the judges and the way they'd like fights to happen.
Sure.
Sometimes that comes down to
But I feel like that Lara fight could be the blueprint for Crawford.
Yeah.
From a left-handed style and making Canelo move all the time, never letting him set up and hit you.
Well, I hope it happens just because we need, first of all, I love when Crawford's in a big fight because that's when I start getting messages from people I haven't talked to in years. They're like, what's going on with this? You know? And I had a good friend from college who I told him, because I talked to Red. We interviewed Red, and I could see it in his eyes. He knew that Crawford was going to kill Spence. Yeah. Like he had this smile on his face, and I told my buddy, I said, dude, Spence got no shot. Trust me, he's got no shot. And he argued all the way. And by the way, he's one of the people still arguing that Spence wasn't right.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, he just got his butt kicked by a superior fighter with a superior strategy and just so much will. You know, kind of will.
I'll say this one more thing about the potential Canelo fight.
Yeah.
Motivation could play a role too. Canelo is going to, if he wins this fight over Crawford, it's gonna be like when he fought Jermell Charlo more recently, and even Jaime Munguia after that. Oh, these are guys who came up from 154. They were smaller. You're supposed to beat that guy. You get no credit, even though those guys were both undefeated, world champions when you fought them. That's the way it's going to be from Canelo's side. Crawford has the motivation of no one ever doing this. Moving up to, no one's ever gone from lightweight 135 to 168 and won that title.
Yeah.
To become a 3-time undisputed champion, no one's ever done. Yeah. And to get to 5 weight classes. Yeah. There are only 5 guys in the history of boxing, and they're Tommy Hearns, Sugar Ray Leonard, Oscar De La Hoya, Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao.
Yeah.
That's what Crawford's going for that night.
Right.
That's an ultimate motivator. And I just think that could be a key factor, too, because there's a lot more on that side.
They didn't have that many weight classes back then, but the ultimate that I was always raised was Sugar Ray Robinson. What Sugar Ray Robinson did, dominating wherever he was only 3 weight classes, but that's the greatest fighter. People always say that's the greatest fighter of all time. Crawford's got the opportunity to put his name up there, Sugar Ray Robinson, which would be, I don't know if young people understand how big of a deal that is.
If he walks away after this, which I think he does if he wins convincingly.
Sure.
If it's close and they can get another payday, I can see a rematch. Yeah. And the only other thing I can say if Crawford wins, why he might stick around is there's enough hatred within the Benavidez family. That if the Benavidez family talks enough and David Benavidez would never get the shot against Canelo, if suddenly they thought he could fight Crawford at 168, I could see Crawford sticking around for that one
for
more
that
time.
Fight, yeah.
So that way he could beat up both of the brothers.
Right.
I could see that happening too, but that's down the road.
Right.
What a swan song this would be if this ends up being his last fight, win or lose, really.
It'd be incredible, and it goes back to young Tony Boone saying that Crawford should be at least in the top 10 of the top 100 of the Omaha World Herald's greatest athletes. This puts him top 5, obviously, and I think you would say that maybe even top 3, 2.
Somebody on this table said that he was the best athlete ever to come out of Nebraska, and it wasn't me.
I said he was the greatest athlete to come out of Nebraska?
There's a big parade downtown, and that might have been how somebody said that at the microphone.
Yeah. Well, listen, the only person that you compare him to is Bob Gibson because of everything that Bob did.
I've said
everything that he did.
At the time you're talking about, back when we made that list, I was saying that you get through the top 3, and you get to the Bob Boozer, Johnny Rogers part at that time.
Right.
And I'm like, that's the area where I thought he should be in then.
Sure.
It's been him in the Sayers-Gibson conversation for a long, long time now.
Right. No, I
agree.
We
have 3 all-time greats
in
sports from this city, and Terrence Crawford is one of the 3.
The next list, I believe, is in 2026. So he certainly would be on there. We want to say thank you to Tony Boone for filling in and getting us in a state of boxing. We want to thank Caleb for producing the show, everybody that puts this thing together, including Dion, who's going to put this thing together. I think it'll help Caleb and get this up on Wednesday morning if we can. Again, thank you to Bud Light and Red Bull and everybody who sponsors the show. We appreciate that. And if you have a chance, subscribe on YouTube if you're watching it there. Also, you, of course, can go on to Spotify or Apple Music, wherever you listen to it as well. We appreciate a like and subscribe. Again, thank you to Tony Boone.
Anytime.
And we'll catch you next week on Let It Fly Show.